Hello everyone, and welcome back to the IA Talks AI. My name's James King, I'm your host, and today we're very lucky to be joined by Luke Waddington, the CEO of BlueFireAI. Luke, we've known each other for a couple of years now, and it's always been very interesting having a conversation with you. You've been doing some great feats with AI for several years now, and I think it's fair to say you're one of the most forward-thinking people in the industry on this topic, so really appreciate you coming in to speak with us today.
Yeah, no, really great to be here, thank you.
Well, maybe we could start with just a bit about you, perhaps, Luke. So could you just give us an overview of yourself and BlueFireAI?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the industry for 25 years, predominantly in investment banking. And what defined that, I think, was always transforming using technology in those businesses. And really, that was to create usually a cheaper manufacturing cost of products and to create better margins in terms of the revenues generated. And that's sort of been my direction of travel. So we've always been automating decisions in the industry, and some of those have been quite straightforward decisions, some of those have been complex. So when we move to what BlueFire is and what it does, in its headline is a decision-making company, and we use artificial intelligence to make those decisions. And where we're sort of looking at is that in previous history, I was always looking at the execution layer and how do we sort of make the decision of transactions and execution more efficient. Now with BlueFire, and we've been in play for now 8 years, so we've sort of been in the AI space for a long time, we are looking at the more complex decision in active asset management. And so as a company, we answer 3 questions, which is really the underpinning of active asset management, which is which companies should I focus on? And that's research and active research on companies. So we automate that research process, that active research process. And once you know which company to focus on, then there's 2 subsequent questions, which are the timing of an investment and also the third question being the size of the capital that you want to deploy. And that's a portfolio management usually decision. So we've also looked to automate that portfolio management decision. So in the end, when we answer those 3 questions, we've created a fully autonomous active asset management capability. And so that's what we've looked to do. And that automates a very complex set of decisions. And that's why new technologies like AI lend themselves to be able to solve those complex decisions.
Well, fascinating stuff. And we're definitely going to come back to the automated AI investment management a bit later. But perhaps before we do, let's reflect on the last year or so, because I think it was probably about a year or so ago that we last had a conversation. And at that time, everyone was getting to grips with generative AI, trying to figure out how they could use it, how they could introduce it within their organizations. So definitely on that journey of, figuring things out. From your perspective, what's happened over the last year or so in that respect, and what's changed perhaps between now and where we were a year ago?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's a few things, and I'll try and be as sort of transparent as possible is probably the sort of wrong phraseology, but sort of I'll give a balanced view in this, because I think it's very easy just to get very fashionable and say how good everything is. But I'll try and give a bit of a balanced opinion to this. So at BlueFire, what we did is we never focused on sort of the generative AI side of things. I don't want to send people on the podcast to sleep, but I will say a word which might do that. We use what's called neurosymbolic AI. Bear with me on that, and I'll go back to it in a moment. But what I see in this generative AI piece is, number one, is people have defaulted to safety first. And when I say safety, what they've done is they're looking at this for an operational efficiency, more back office, and more sort of cost savings, because that's a safer place to be with this. It's a more probably straight line to understand it. And I don't see a lot of people sort of moving towards the more difficult areas, which are making complex investment decisions and more of that front office view. So I see there's a lot of convalescing in the sort of in the cost reduction efforts. We have to then go back to the hype cycle. This will go through a hype cycle, so get ready for the failure in this because it's not perfect. And so we've got a rush of excitement, and we're getting to the peak of the hype cycle, I think, before people will start to see certain failures with the technology, and then we'll start to sort of steady out. Now, just back to the point about why we don't use generative AI in terms of the large language models for the creation of our decisions, our investment decisions, is because we see that the generative AI, the LLM path, is really trying to create patterns on big data. And what we find is it's quite random that you find a pattern that would be stable and strong enough to put capital against that decision. So this goes back to that sort of neurosymbolic AI. It also goes back to the point of why we're 8 years old, because it takes a long time to develop these pieces and find out exactly, the stability of these. And so when I do go back to that neurosymbolic nature, to try and make that as simple as possible in its explanation, is the symbolic nature of that is what we've done is we've engaged with industry experts over this last 8 years, and we've downloaded their experience of how you look at certain things. So, for example, we will work with one of the best bank analysts that we know, and we will then look to work out exactly how that person over 2 decades of experience has really looked at a bank and a financial institution. And we will then see different pieces, which we call symbologies. These are heuristics and characteristics of how a bank operates. And we will then use the neural network component to sort of optimize that piece. And what we'll find is someone might have built their career on 25 or 30 key things that work. But when you actually boil it down, it might be only 2 things that are really stable and consistent over time. So if you think over 8 years, we've slowly just seeded all of the algorithmic sort of decision making with known experience from the industry. And that's really the definition of neurosymbolic. What do you end up with there? You end up with precision on small data. And then that becomes, and that stability and that precision allows you to then be quite confident in making very high quality investment decisions. So what I see at the moment over the last year is that there is a lot of fashion, there's a lot of excitement, and it's all really good. And some of it's well focused. It seems to be focused on cost savings in the safe space. If the decision's not necessarily so right, it doesn't necessarily matter so much. But I think eventually people will realize that there has to be some intersection with the industry's experience and these large language models and generative AI.
So what do you think needs to change perhaps then for us to, move away from the very safe use cases as you've described towards the more, sort of the higher value prizes perhaps that can be achieved by some of the things you've been talking about?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, and again, I want to try and be the glass half full, but I think the first thing that's going to happen is there's going to be some failures. But in that failure, you find the strength. And then once you've plateaued where that consistent piece of strength is, you can then have more confidence to start implementing it into sort of more higher value areas of the business. And that sounds quite defeatist, because it's almost like it's, again, by definition, almost set up to fail. But I think that it's got to go through that cycle first. I think there has to be some degree of organizational change in organizations where this isn't just a thing done by AI researchers or academic or technology. There has to be for us at BlueFire, we've always done this. There's the 3 components that make the magic. And that is very good mathematicians, very good domain experts, and very good programmers. And you have to get the convalescence of those 3 together. And I think that's where you get the magic, and for me, it goes back to that point I mentioned just before, is that it's the domain knowledge that's got to intersect with this. It can't just be those tech guys in the corner, can you have a go at solving that problem? I think that's where you'll get, the least amount of confidence and value to progress it into some of these higher risk sort of decision areas you want to take it.
Now, one of the arguments that I've heard made against using AI for decision making is that perhaps it might not be very well suited to when you have exogenous shocks. So very unexpected, black swan type events that might occur. We can look at recent examples. We had the COVID pandemic. Russia invading Ukraine would be another example. We might not necessarily have data that would reflect those types of scenarios playing out in front of us. And the argument goes that that's where, humans are really what you need around, because they can sort of make sense of the world in a way that AI might not be quite so adept at doing. Do you have any sort of thoughts?
I mean, I'd come at this in a different way and say the current industry suffers from that. Before we even think that AI suffers from that. So the industry, when it's used technology to make decisions, it's not a new thing. We've used what's called quant and quantitative processes. Those quantitative processes, not to be too mathematical to the point, are pretty much linear-based decision-making, weighted linear decision-making. They don't know what happens when regimes change. They expect history to repeat themselves. So they fall down now. So the industry is actually built on not being able to discover black swan events now. And I would also argue that humans aren't very good at it as well. We have bias and we believe, and we are a bit more rose-tinted glasses. And so when black swan events come along, we all still get hammered by them. And that's a human trait as well. So when we go to AI and more complex decision making, and I don't want to be too technical on this podcast, some of the phrases are very loaded when I say them, but we use, if I put the headline to this to make it accessible, is we use and have built regime agnostic ways of making decisions. And so when I say regime agnostic, that means that it can adapt when regimes change. And so the most beautiful thing we've had over the last 8 years is I don't think that the world has thrown as many different regimes changes into 8 years in any point of history. So we've had everything from wars, pandemics, change in economic cycles, inflation, interest rates, tariffs. So in the last 8 years, you can really road test whether AI adapts. So my counter to your point is actually that the world now doesn't deal with black swans, and AI actually is something that can be adapted to deal with that, rather than being so rigid like quantitative processes and humans are.
Okay, so looking forward, Luke, how do you see AI having an impact on the investment management industry, into the future over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think I'll try and condense this down. Please sort of interrupt me and guide me a little bit if I speak too long on it. But my background, when it comes back to sort of the introduction, is and I'll take the example of the foreign exchange market. So in the early 2000s, walking into the foreign exchange markets, it suffered from a compression of fees and a reduction in margins, and in some businesses they were loss leading. And so there was 3 things that happened. Some people closed those businesses down. Some people consolidated them, and then some people transformed them using technology. And then some people went to things like emerging markets and used exactly the same business model, but there was more margins available. So I come in and I look at active asset management and I see exactly the same thing happening today. The well-trodden story of active asset management is that there's been fee compression and margin compression, and everyone knows that, and everyone has been cost-cutting into that. But we're now at a moment where that same 3 points come up. Do we close the business down because it's not economical? Do we consolidate them together, or do we transform them using technology? Because at the end of the day, the economics of traditional active asset management are now too strained. So some people say, well, I'm going to use the same business model and go towards private, because exactly like going towards emerging markets, because there's margin available still. And so you can see there's a bit of a rush towards private, but with the same business model. What we see is the fact that if you can produce a cheaper and more better economics, higher margin by automating and transforming the decision, then you can transform that active asset management. And if you look back at that foreign exchange example, people like Barclays, Deutsche, Citibank transformed, and then they became number 1, 2, 3 in the world in foreign exchange because of that technological transformation with better margins and large scale. And then if you look now, they've been eclipsed by just a technology company, XTX, which is number 1 in the world. So I see the same thing playing out in active asset management. And that is, what is AI going to do here? It's going to change the economics of that business, in the sense of it's going to be a cheaper manufacturing cost to manufacture that active decision. And that goes back to what we do as a company and those 3 questions that I mentioned in terms of which company to focus on, timing and weighting of capital, which is the ultimate active decision. And it's going to be able to be more consistent and performant, which means that the fees, and especially things like performance fees, can not necessarily recover, but can at least sort of be argued to be more rewarding. And so therefore better margins. So that's what I sort of see playing here. And it's a really nice and interesting moment. The doomsayers of everybody would be like, oh, well, I'm going to lose jobs and there's going to be, robots taking over and all of these things. But when you look at the foreign exchange businesses and go back to that example, there's more people working in foreign exchange now than there probably was in 2000, because the market itself grows. when you do and put in this transformation and automation. So I think there's a very positive story, but it's going to be, let me be a bit over expressive, it's going to be brutal in its change.
Well, thank you, Luke. That certainly gives us that sort of high level, big picture. But if we could bring it down a level, perhaps, let's think about the people working within investment management firms and how they're using AI in their day-to-day working lives. How do you see that changing over the next coming years as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting evolution. This is something that I'm actually, personally, beyond sort of, what we do at BlueFire, but personally very, really interested in and have got a passion for, is the interaction of machine-generated decisions and human beings. And how do we interact? Because that, for me, is not solved yet. And if I put the example of, say, driverless cars and I asked a group of 100 people, would you go for a test drive in a driverless car? I think everybody's excited. Everybody wants to do that. But if you said to them, would you get in it without the steering wheel? Then a few people put their hands down. And then you say, well, would you get in the driverless car with the seat facing backwards and no steering wheel? And more people put their hands down. And then you say, would you go at 70 miles an hour facing backwards with no steering wheel down the motorway? And nearly everybody puts their hand down. And then the ultimate question is, would you buy it? And nobody is putting their hands up at the moment. So that for me is the process of adoption of machines making decisions. And if we go back to the asset management business, the first place where this will happen is a co-pilot model, which is where the steering wheel's still in the room and the driver's still in the seat. And so this will be, and that's where it goes into that safer space of efficiency and people using that co-pilot model and having decision support in what they do and or efficiency support in tasks that they do. I think the key thing as well with this, and people don't recognize this too much, and I think if you went into most financial institutions, I usually ask one question when it comes down to the people who are implementing this, and that is, are you working with a psychologist in this? And nobody is. Because at the end of the day, this is psychology. The adoption of this is psychology and how you get some of these pieces into play. And we design things just looking at it as a function. You wanted this graph and you wanted this button to do this for you. Please, can it do it? Rather than some of the psychology. And if you look at social technologies, it's all embedded with psychology. Things like scrolling and all of these different things. And that's, for me, an unsolved thing. So I think to be really pragmatic, it's going to go into co-pilot. We're going to be person in the seat with a steering wheel using AI to try and create efficiencies. But to get that further, to go more, take the driver out, take the steering wheel out, we're going to have to, this is a very uninvented psychology at the end of the day, in the design frames of it. So I think that's where it's going to sort of have its first cycle of implementation into most organizations.
Fascinating stuff, Luke. If I could shift gears for a second, there was something else that I wanted to ask you about, and that's the current direction of travel with LLMs and the technological developments. I've started to, read some articles in the news sort of suggesting that maybe, the technology is potentially starting to just plateau ever so slightly, and subsequent editions of models that hit the market, people saying, oh, well, it's not as good as the last one, or it's not performing quite the same way, or maybe it's just not the leap forward that, maybe we'd become accustomed to. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, not to sort of contradict what I said earlier in terms of us not necessarily using generative AI, but we do obviously look at LLMs. We do quite a lot of research and development on them to make sure that we're up to speed with all the quality of the different models, because it's changing quite quickly across quite a wide landscape. What we find at the moment, so just a few sort of simple points to this, is people talk about hallucination quite a lot, but no one really defines necessarily hallucination in terms of, is that really generating a output which doesn't exist? I mean, if I define it like that, one of the weaknesses at the moment with large language models is if they can't find an answer, it forces an answer. It doesn't want to not give you an answer. So if you look at it, say, from a numerical point of view, and I'm looking at ratios on a financial balance sheet, if there is a blank field, it will try and put a number into that field. And therefore, if it then creates a ratio from that, it will be wrong. So at the moment, it's sort of a little bit too aggressive at forcing answers rather than just saying, sorry, I don't know, or I haven't got it. And I think, and then the way that it works with numbers is not always fully accurate as well. So you do get, you're still in your sort of 90% accuracy, but, in the world we're in, we can't be, we've got to be 100% in terms of accuracy. So some of these things and these wrinkles, I would call them, need to be sorted out in that sort of thing, that forced answer sort of nature of it. The other thing which is quite interesting is then things like cognitive decline. So there was quite a big survey done, a piece of study done by BMJ, and you can look this up online. And what they did was they took a human-based cognitive test and then applied that test and got the LLMs to take that test. It's quite interesting because the LLM is visually impaired, basically. So they did it as though they were doing a cognitive test on a blind person or a visually impaired person. And the results are quite interesting because what you see is the fact that just like in humans, first of all, 26 out of 30 is a normal score that a human would get with no cognitive issues. None of the LLMs got to 26. They were all sort of between 16 and some were just near sort of 24, 25. So the first thing that says is that there is some degree of cognitive distress in the LLM, in all LLMs. The second thing they did then was look at the history of the models. And just like in humans, the older the model, the higher the decline. So the first generation models of LLM in this cognitive test showing signs of dementia, basically. And so the older the models get, and so the new models are the highest score. So what you've got in there is you think that these are, because at the end of the day, we have to compare them to this sort of neurological sort of piece. They're not as necessarily as acute and showing exactly the same strength as humans at the moment. And so that's something that's quite interesting that people I don't think sort of recognise too much in this this view of them. And so that's quite an interesting point in terms of that cognitive decline. I think a second thing is that for all intent and purposes, LLMs have consumed all digital information available that's been created, and there isn't any new data. So what's happening now is that LLMs are creating synthetic data to train on. So if I've read every single book on economics that exists in the world, and there's no more books to read, how do I get better? And then I start to write my own versions of books. And then I train myself off that. So if you're starting to train off synthetic data, not primary data, there's going to be an erosion as well. And so now the subsequent models that are coming out, it would be really interesting to see if they still progress further towards this 26 out of 30, or whether there's a decline in this because it's not using necessarily primary data to train, because it's already used all the primary data to train. And so there's these sort of nuanced pieces that are running through this, which, I think, and I've only probably touched on 2 or 3, there's a lot of different aspects to this in terms of how LLMs, are sort of evolving.
So I'd like to get your thoughts on what might be driving that, as you say, cognitive decline. Is it that second point that, because there's no new data, perhaps, the models are learning based on data that now contains the outputs of AI itself, and this is sort of eroding the quality? Is that one of the drivers then?
I think that's what you can say. First of all, there's 2 things. Number one is, did they ever get to that level? So more is a case of, it's not like it was at a 26 out of 30, like a human sort of, it wasn't there anyway. So it's the first thing is that it's not like these were built as sort of supreme sort of winners at the beginning. They've still got to evolve as well. And that's more from the actual training and the construct of them before we think about necessarily just the data side of them. The second thing then is, to your point on the data side of things, is that I think it's just rational to make the argument, and I'm doing this from just a personal view. It's not because I've done any studies or anything on it, but it's a case, it must be a rational, logical view to say that if you are consuming secondary information to train, that quality of that information is not going to be as strong as primary. And therefore, by definition, you're either at best going to get diminishing returns, and at worst, you're going to get actually a diminishing ability. And I don't know which one of those is the answer until I start to see the evolution of models over a longer period of time. But I think the word diminish in there is probably the key word.
Well, you could almost imagine a situation where, being able to capture a snapshot of the world and all the information in it at a point in time, let's say, like 2019, perhaps, before the generative AI boom, that could be quite useful because, you've got a data set then that says, right, this is like all of the human output and history up until a point in time before AI came on the scene. And after that point, you start to sort of have the secondary information introduced.
Yes. And then it goes back to that point I made just earlier, is the fact that then, just like humans age, so does AI. And therefore, what you've seen in the study that I've mentioned is that the older models start to have a decline as well. So if you put those two things you mentioned together, that there isn't new information or new primary information, and you start getting sort of not as much pickup in your new models, you're going to probably end up with a slow sort of decline at some point in this. And it's just whether the baseline is strong enough for us to work on. I believe it absolutely is. And that baseline is always going to be efficient, strong, and it's going to be able to create a lot of change in the industries and everything we look at. But the question is does that baseline keep accelerating higher? And I don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, well, hopefully we get to a successful place. Luke, if you had to bet money on it right now, would you say that this is going to be an irreversible problem, or are we going to somehow come through the other side?
Well, to be honest, that's an easy answer. I've already bet everything on red because we've created BlueFire. So I believe in one thing, and that is that this is going to be the future, and we're definitely going to come through it, and it's going to be super interesting. And so the bet is already on.
Well, let's hope so. And that's a fantastic point on which to end. So thank you very much, Luke. It's a fascinating conversation. And thank you very much to everyone for listening. Do join us again for more episodes soon. Thank you.
Thank you.